In October 1967, Soviet Russia celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Communist Revolution. Nearly every major American magazine carried feature stories displaying the tremendous progress made by the communists in the fields of science, industry, and technology. This segment of the news media was telling the American people that the communist system was enormously successful, if not wholly desirable. Honest history, however, presents a somewhat different picture of a nation that has, time after time, been saved from disaster through transfusions of food, money, and technology from the West, its avowed enemy. The Great Pretense: how to finance communism while ostensibly opposing it. The takeover of Russia by Bolshevism was not a spontaneous revolution of landless peasants and workers, but was a carefully designed plot, organized and financed from outside of Russia. Lenin was imported into Russia from Germany, and Leon Trotsky left his exile in New York City with a revolutionary cadre determined to make Russia the home of world communism. Revolutions are expensive. The money for the Bolshevik Revolution came primarily from Germany and the United States. One of the chief German financiers of the Russian Revolution was M.M. Warburg, who made millions available to the Russian communists through a bank in Sweden. In America, Jacob Schiff, a partner and brother-in-law of Warburg, contributed $20 million to the Russian Revolution. 3 years after the revolution, Russia presented a picture of untilled fields and idle factories. All was chaos. Production had been reduced to 1/7 of the already low pre-war level. Such was the result of radical socialization. In order to save communism, Lenin ordered a complete about-face. In 1921, he announced his new economic policy, known as NEP. Lenin called upon the mighty industrial powers of the West with their engineers, research scientists, and technologists to come to Russia so that Bolshevik progress might begin. Lenin said of the hated capitalists, quote, "They will furnish credits which will serve as a means to support the communist parties, and by supplying us with materials and techniques which are not available to us, they will rebuild our war industry, which is essential to our future attacks on our own suppliers. In other words, they will be laboring to prepare their own suicide." Historian Werner Keller, in his excellent book, East minus West equals Zero, describes how capitalism built communism. The first modern aircraft factory in Russia was built by the German Junkers concern. Thus, Soviet air power was born. Large numbers of Soviet engineers and workers were trained. Many hundreds of Russian pilots were thoroughly instructed by German test pilots, and the first Russian airline network was created. Eventually, the Soviets began to cold shoulder the Junkers people, exactly as they would do in the case of other concessionaires when the foreigners from the West had fulfilled their function. Ultra-modern gold mining installations were constructed in Russia by Lena Goldfields Limited, an English firm. The gold mined from the Lena field by hundreds of thousands of slave laborers provided much of the money with which Russia paid the capitalists for building the industrial capacity of the USSR. Other foreign exchange money was obtained by deliberately starving to death millions of Russians so that wheat could be exported. The United States has been Russia's prime patron ever since the Russian Revolution. In 1921, Herbert Hoover set up an international organization to end famine in Russia. The United States alone sent 700,000 tons of foodstuffs. While many lives were saved, the communist system was also saved, with the result that millions have lost their lives and the Russian people were deprived of their best opportunity to throw off the yoke of their slave masters. American industrialists made private agreements with the Soviet Union. Thus, U.S. firms acquired gold prospecting rights. The Standard Oil Company won an oil boring concession. Averell Harriman built mines to work manganese ore deposits. General Electric sold Moscow electrical equipment to the value of over $20 million, and other American firms set about re-equipping Russian industry. From 1921 to 1925, $37 million of machinery and equipment were pumped into the Soviet economy by American industry. In 1928, the NEP was replaced by the first 5-year plan, which promised to transform the Soviet Union from an agricultural into an industrial economy. Such a vast project was impossible without the active help of Western industry and its unlimited supplies and expert technical knowledge. By the time the first plan was announced, The essential contracts had already been signed by Western firms, which was why the Soviets appeared so confident in projecting their goals. Unobserved by the American public, some of the largest American industrial concerns, which were steadily insulted in the Soviet press as, quote, the last strongholds of imperialist capitalism, began doing business with the communists. Orders worth millions of dollars poured into the offices of these great firms. In 1930, the Bolsheviks arranged for the Ford Motor Company to establish the Russian motor car industry. The Soviet representatives signed contracts with Henry Ford for patent licenses, technical assistance and advice, plus an inventory of spare parts. Ford technicians were sent to Russia to train the Russians in assembling automobiles. The factory was to be capable of turning out 140,000 cars a year, and an Ohio construction company contracted to build the factory. The town of Gorky was transformed into the Detroit of Russia. The Russian steel industry is another example of Russian power made in the USA. A Cleveland firm contracted to do nothing less than rebuild a copy of the city of Gary, Indiana, the center of American iron and steel industry, on Russian soil. This was to be the huge Soviet steel complex, Magnitogorsk. Without iron, there can be no steel. Without steel, no heavy industry. Americans made Magnitogorsk the biggest iron and steel works in the world. Tractors were a necessity to modernize Soviet agriculture. A Detroit engineer designed and constructed a tractor factory without parallel in any other country. The assembly works were 2,000 feet long and 650 feet wide, covering an area of 30 acres. The tractors produced were copies of the American Caterpillar Company, but there were no arrangements made for payment for use of the patent. Russia merely bought one sample and copied it. The factory was so designed that production could be adapted almost overnight to the production of another, less innocuous commodity, tanks. The communists achieved a propaganda victory by distributing millions of pictures around the globe of the world's largest hydroelectric installation and dam at Dniprogus. It was considered a classic of communist development. Actually, it represented the peak of American achievement. It was designed and built by Colonel Hugh Cooper, who built the dam at Muscle Shoals, Tennessee. The power plant increased Russia's hydroelectric system output by 6 times and produced more power than Niagara Falls. Still, by 1933, Russia was once again on the verge of collapse. And again, it was America which saved the communist regime, this time through official diplomatic recognition of the communists. On the verge of financial collapse, Russia had been staying alive by what amounted to the kiting of checks on an international level. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt reversed the position of 4 other United States presidents and recognized the legitimacy of the communist government, the prestige and thereby the credit of the communists skyrocketed overnight. The American government and the American press heralded the Soviets as great believers in liberty and democracy during World War II. In view of the communist unbroken record of calling for world conquest by communist imperialism, there was no reason why anyone in America should have been so fooled. But once again, the United States saved the Soviet Union from destruction through the medium of Lend-Lease. While many Americans felt that the world's 2 worst criminal dictators, Hitler and Stalin, should be allowed to fight each other to the death, America intervened with all its might on the side of the Red Dictator. A man in charge of Russian Lend-Lease was the mysterious Harry Hopkins, the alter ego of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who actually lived in the White House. Writer-historian William Henry Chamberlain has written that Hopkins was, quote, after the president, the most powerful man in America during the war. Hopkins, at a Russian aid rally in Madison Square Garden in June 1942, said, quote, we are determined that nothing shall stop us from sharing with you all that we have. Major General John Dean, an expert on Russian Lend-Lease, said that Hopkins' desire to help the Russians was, quote, carried out with a zeal which approached fanaticism. Materials destined for General MacArthur in the South Pacific were rerouted to Russia through the influence of Harry Hopkins. In letters to American agencies dated March 7, 1942, President Roosevelt ordered that preferential position in matters of munitions should be given to the Soviet Union over all other allies and even the armed forces of the United States. Major General Dean later wrote that then and there was, quote, the beginning of a policy of appeasement of Russia from which we have never recovered and from which we are still suffering. American help went to the Soviet Union at a crucial moment. It is officially estimated that the U.S. sent the USSR over $11 billion in goods, plus the cost of transportation to Russia. Vice President Henry Wallace addressed the American people over radio on July 9, 1944, after returning from a trip to Russia. He gloated, quote, "I found American flour in the Soviet Far East, American aluminum in Soviet airplane factories, American steel in trucks and railway repair shops, American machine tools in shipbuilding yards, American compressors and electrical equipment on Soviet naval vessels, American electric shovels in open-cut coal mines, American core drills in the copper mines of Central Asia, and American trucks and planes performing strategic transportation functions. Over half the value of goods sent were non-munitions. The variety of goods shipped to Russia runs into the thousands, consisting of almost every product imaginable. It has been called the greatest mail-order catalog in history. What did America send to Russia between 1941 and 1945? 2,660 ships with a total cargo of 16.25 million tons left American ports for the Soviet Union. America donated over 15,000 planes to the Soviets. The Russian transportation system, which had almost broken down, was completely re-equipped. 1,900 steam locomotives and 66 diesels were sent by the U.S., together with 10,000 railway cars, shipload after shipload of machine tools, complete industrial plants, spare parts and armaments, textiles and footwear were unloaded in Russian ports. Of inestimable value were the supplies of foodstuffs. Nearly 4.5 million tons of tinned meat, sugar, flour, and fats were sent from America. Gold mining equipment from American mines, which had been closed by government orders, were shipped to the Russians at the express orders of the Treasury Department's Harry Dexter White. The headquarters of the Soviet espionage ring was in Washington, and the Soviet Purchasing Commission called Amtorg, which was officially concerned with administering Lend-Lease. The government watched the activities of the Soviet agents with incredible tolerance. The worst that could happen to an agent was a polite request that he leave the country. In such cases, an official of the FBI would accompany the agent to the boat or plane leaving for Moscow, but without checking his luggage or briefcase. Among the items obtained by Amtorg spies were designs of industrial plants, special machines, parts and details, photographs and blueprints of technical processes in aviation, arms, oil, submarine building, and many other industries, plus complete maps of the United States and locations of strategic defense plants and military installations. The technical information stolen by the Russians was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The tens of tons of stolen documents, plans, and other technical data were shipped to Russia across the Arctic by airplane, or were packed into the holds of Soviet cargo ships with no customs inspection because they had diplomatic immunity. With tools, machinery, or apparatus too heavy or too bulky for this procedure, the Soviets developed another technique. The goods were declared as something other than what they were. For example, secret radar sets were declared as truck engines, which were permitted exports under Lend-Lease. Tens of thousands of patents were copied and shipped in diplomatic pouches to the Soviet Union. Our patent office was thrown open to a crew of technical experts from the Amtorg Corporation. They were on full-time duty and spent every day going over the files to pick out what they wanted. The House Committee on Un-American Activities stated in 1949 that the number of patents acquired, quote, runs into the hundreds of thousands. Included in the patents were top military items. The communists not only had access to military proving grounds where the most secret weapons were under development, but also the State Department issued an order allowing the Russians to visit any restricted industrial plant and to take motion pictures of intricate machinery and manufacturing processes. FBI reports on all of this piled up in Washington, but the government kept these reports confidential and did nothing about it. One of the first persons to expose this incredible story was Major George Racy Jordan, who, in 1949, before a congressional committee, revealed diaries that he had kept while in charge of expediting Lend-Lease to Russia from the giant Great Falls, Montana Air Base. Major Jordan had kept meticulous records of the unbelievable manner in which the Russians were allowed to ship goods and documents out of the country. Many of the cargo planes which left Great Falls contained 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of mail for the Soviet Union. Americans were not allowed to inspect these consignments, which were carried in large, cheap black suitcases and accompanied by 2 guards under order to ensure there were no checks. The event which motivated Major Jordan to make his diaries available was the explosion in September 1949 of an atom bomb by the Soviets. Major Jordan testified that included among the shipments of strategic goods out of Great Falls to Russia were quantities of heavy water and uranium. At the time, Major Jordan, like almost all other Americans, knew nothing of the significance of heavy water and uranium. He had been ordered over the telephone by Harry Hopkins to expedite certain experimental chemicals to Russia and leave it off the records. This was uranium ore, which was shipped from Canada. The bills of lading are shown here. Major Jordan said of this shipment, quote, "It was the only one out of a tremendous multitude of consignments that I was ordered not to enter on my tally sheet. It was the only one I was forbidden to discuss with my superiors, and the only one I was directed to keep secret from everybody." American military intelligence in charge of the Manhattan Project, as the atom bomb experiments were called, blocked most shipments of uranium to Russia. Therefore, the Russians went around military intelligence with the help of Harry Hopkins and got the uranium directly from Canada. Another major shipment of uranium was disguised as a commercial transaction within American territory and was shipped by the Eastman Kodak Company. Over $13 million of aluminum tubes used to cook or transmute uranium into plutonium were sent to Russia. Almost 900,000 pounds of cadmium metal rods to control the intensity of the atomic pile were lend-leased to the Reds, along with 3,600 tons of natural graphite and 437 tons of cobalt. All of these materials were scarce in the United States. In September 1949, the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb, years ahead of what any expert had predicted. Mountains of reports, drawings, blueprints, and photostats were piling up in Moscow. The number was so large that a vast Soviet staff was occupied solely with checking and evaluating the reports collected by their agents and delivered to Moscow. The Russian scientists and technicians had everything they needed for technical calculations, down to detailed drawings with the most intricate precision parts and the most complicated equipment. Without this advantage, it would have taken 10 years at least to arrive at the stage reached by the United States in 1945. Gaps in the Soviet atomic program were to be filled by the tremendous campaign of looting Germany in 1945. 200 German scientists and engineers were deported and forced to work in the Soviet atomic laboratories. The Soviets received from the British and American zones all the patents, open and secret, of both heavy and light industry, and it cost them nothing. Moscow had only to order photostats from London and Washington. While Russia looted Germany, the United States rebuilt Germany through the Marshall Plan, thereby indirectly building Russian industry. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany not only because it had been destroyed by bombers, but also because it had been looted by the Russians. Russia also kidnapped an army of technicians, scientists, and specialists to rebuild and run the factories in Russia. In the autumn of 1957, the Soviet Union announced it had succeeded in sending the first artificial satellites into space. The Sputniks completely overwhelmed and astonished the West. The story behind this event went back 12 years to April 11, 1945, when advanced units of General Patton's 3rd Armored Division captured the small town of Nordhausen in Germany. Located near Nordhausen was the heart of Germany's V-2 rocket program. 2 days later, however, the Americans were ordered to evacuate the vast underground factory and to turn it over to the Russians. General Dwight Eisenhower had signed an order to the effect that, quote, "All factories, installations, works, research institutes, laboratories, patents, plans, drawings, and inventions must be placed intact and in good condition at the disposal of the Allied representatives." This order originated in the Yalta Conference, in which Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed to Stalin's request for 80% of German industry as reparations. Fortunately, Major I.P. Hamill disobeyed what he apparently felt were treasonous orders and removed hundreds of almost completed V-2 rockets and a number of valuable documents from the underground arsenal. In 1945, the Germans were already working on a long-range rocket. Its eventual use as a carrier rocket for satellites was also envisaged. over 1,000 machine tools for the production of rockets, and mountains of documents, all stamped top secret, were turned over to the Soviets, including blueprints for the future development of the V-2 and the completed plans for putting satellites into space. Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Shabinsky, a Russian officer in charge of looting the Nordhausen factory, who later defected to the West, said that when the works was complete, the Russians drank toast shouting, quote, "What fools these Americans are." The Nordhausen factory itself was subsequently moved, lock, stock, and wind tunnel, to the Soviet Union, where German scientists and German facilities became the nucleus of Russia's vaunted space program. As the haze of smoke slowly lifted from the pulverized cities of Europe, it soon became apparent who had really won the Second World War. The Soviet Union could count enormous territorial gains, and a vast amount of human skill and industrial potential had fallen into its lap. And we turned over European and Asian nations to the communists. The gobbling up of Central Europe and the inserting of communist puppet regimes was partially financed by billions of American dollars given through UNRRA, supposedly to help war-ravaged Europe. The communists have kept their peoples in slavery with American foreign aid money. Although it is a closely guarded secret how much wheat we have provided the Soviets, in the span of little over 1 month during 1964, America delivered to Soviet Russia over 65 million bushels of wheat. This is the equivalent of 1 bushel of wheat for every third man, woman, and child in the Soviet Union. The wheat deal was subsidized by American taxpayers to the tune of $42 million, according to former Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson. Meanwhile, Russia was shipping wheat to Cuba. President Johnson was not kidding when he spoke of building bridges with the communists in October 1966. On October 13th, the New York Times announced that the Department of Commerce had authorized shipment of more than 400 heretofore strategic items to communist countries. The administration took no chances on obtaining congressional approval of its communist trade expansion program, but did it by executive order. According to the New York Times, among the 400 items which became non-strategic at the stroke of a pen were rubber, petroleum, chemical compounds, medicines, plastics, metal products, machinery, and scientific and professional instruments. During World War II, anyone who advocated providing the Nazis with such equipment would have been universally denounced as crazy or worse. During that war, we lost hundreds of airplanes and thousands of aviators bombing the critical German ball bearing works at Schweinfurt. Today, we sell the communist ball bearings, on credit, of course. Our first representative at the Paris Peace Conferences, Averell Harriman, said that those who oppose aid and trade with communists are, quote, bigoted and pig-headed. The State Department has issued a pamphlet heaping scorn on those who oppose trading with the communists. While the newspapers, magazines, and television are capable of publishing and reporting infinite amounts of information about some things, aid and trade with the enemy is apparently a taboo subject. The so-called establishment is moving heaven and earth to keep the American people from learning the truth about these policies. The insiders have built the communist world on your tax dollars.